On this day in 1984, Celtic wore a sponsor's name on their shirts for the very first time. Celtic and Rangers announced on the 13th of September 1984 that a deal had been struck for the Glasgow teams to be sponsored by Dunfermline-based double glazing firm C.R. Smith. Worth £500,000 over 3 years, the joint deal was a tacit acknowledgement that no Scottish company would want to be associated exclusively with either club. Jim Reynolds wrote in the Glasgow Herald of the 14th of September 1984, "For obvious reasons, and sad ones, it would have been extremely difficult for either club to have attracted a major sponsor, and for the past year they have been working jointly in an effort to raise a cash injection." To call the move unpopular with fans would be an understatement, but the times they were a-changing, and a year after the television ban on broadcasting matches of teams with sponsorships on their jerseys was lifted, it was probably inevitable that Celtic would bow to the prevailing commercialisation of the game. Nevertheless, putting a sponsor's name on the hitherto sacrosanct hoops was bad enough on its own, but as an early edition of fanzine Not The View put it, C.R. Smith sat on the hoops with all the aesthetic subtlety of a blob of tar. The first appearance of the C.R. Smith brand on the jersey came at Dens Park on the 29th of September 1984. Celtic were in third place after 7 matches, having drawn 3 of their first 4 games and were already 3 points behind defending champions Aberdeen. This was a Celtic team that on their game were outstanding, but if they were not on their game, they could be abysmal. As they would prove at Dens Park that day, they could be both in the same match. On a sunny autumn afternoon, Celtic lined up Bonner, McGrain, Reid, Aitken, McAdam, Grant, Colquhoun, McStay, McClare, Burns, McGarvey, subs, McLeod, Provan. In a rollercoaster match, Celtic were at their best in the first 30 minutes, Ian Paul writing in the Glasgow Herald of the 1st of October 1984, "In the first half hour or so, Celtic were as good as they have been for a long time, sweeping towards Carson in exciting, accurate and skillful moves, many of which revolved around the intricacies of striker Frank McGarvey." A foul on McGarvey before 2 minutes were on the clock saw Celtic awarded a penalty, which Mark Reid blasted off the crossbar. Brian McClare missed an easy chance before they were given a second opportunity from the spot. Chick Young reported in the Evening Times of the 29th of September 1984, "After 22 minutes, Celtic were awarded a second penalty when McGeechy brought down McGarvey, and this time young Peter Grant made no mistake from the spot." 5 minutes later, Celtic went 2 ahead, McGarvey again heavily involved. Hugh Keevins wrote in The Scotsman of the 1st of October 1984, "The industrious McGarvey, trying hard at this point to be the best man on the park, then tied Dundee's defence in a fankle to the extent that the diminutive Colquhoun, who couldn't hurt his head if he jumped in a phone box, scored from a header. Up until then, Celtic were playing remarkably well. So well, they obviously decided to take the rest of the day off." As Celtic switched off, Dundee captain John McCormack was allowed to wander through the midfield before unleashing a thunderous 25-yard shot that dipped just under the bar after flying past Pat Bonner. In what Keevins described in The Scotsman as a schizophrenic performance, a suddenly sluggish Celtic failed to heed several early warnings at the beginning of the second half and conceded an inevitable equaliser on the hour mark, Ray Stephen being allowed acres of space in the box to slot past Bonner. A bad day threatened to get even worse when Hugh Alexander pointed to the spot for the 3rd time in the match, this time for Dundee. Ian Paul reported, "They could have completed a memorable comeback when they were given what looked to me a soft penalty after Richardson and McAdam fell in the box. John Brown's spot kick, however, was well saved by Pat Bonner." In a match littered with contentious moments, Tommy Burns scored the winner 7 minutes from time. Hugh Keevins reported, "Within minutes, Burns raced to the other end, dispossessed Rafferty in a debatable fashion, and side-footed the ball into an empty goal after Carson had saved his first attempt." Chick Young and Ian Paul identified George McGeechy as the Dundee player involved in the challenge with Burns, but it was Stuart Rafferty who was booked by the referee for protesting about the goal being allowed to stand. The match was a much-needed boost for Celtic, who had been facing rumblings of discontent from the terraces. Speculation was rife that Billy McNeill could be appointed manager of Hibernian, and Hugh Keevins wrote in his match report, "It was bawdy, exceptional entertainment, which only became out of order on 2 occasions. The first was when Knox was struck on the head by something projected from the crowd behind him as he exhorted his team to tighten the screws on a Celtic side, showing signs of giving in at 2 goals each. The second, also coming during that 20-minute juncture when all was equal, was advice sung from the same section of the enclosure to the effect that there was no other manager quite like Billy McNeill. Clearly, the speculation surrounding the immediate future of the former Celtic manager and Hibs is arousing strong feelings in certain quarters, which may be understandable, but not entirely fair on the present incumbent at Parkhead, Davy Hay, who does, after all, have enough to contend with this week in Ghent and then Aberdeen on Saturday." The under-fire Hay would win both of these upcoming matches, relieving the immediate pressure, and he would finish the season with his first trophy as Celtic manager in dramatic fashion in the Scottish Cup final in May. As for C.R. Smith, their name would adorn the hoops for the next 7 years when they were replaced by People's Ford in red and blue lettering, by which time Rangers had already struck out on their own with McEwen's Lager in 1987, proving that the two clubs didn't need a joint sponsor after all. After a 2-year break, C.R. Smith returned for another 4-year stint from 1993 to 97. To date, they remain Celtic's longest running sponsor.